Hi again. Today we're going to talk about Anselm of Canterbury's other argument for God's existence, that is to say, the one that appears just after the famous ontological argument in the Proslogion. It's also an ontological argument. It's one that is very similar to the first one, and in fact so similar that some scholars think it's really just the same argument. But others think it's very different and much more powerful. So I want to consider that argument independently and see whether it has a different structure, see what kind of power it has, see whether the same objection can be raised or whether it does a better job of actually establishing God's existence in reality. So let's take a look at the argument in Proslogion 3. And certainly this being, that, than which a greater cannot be thought, so truly exists that it can't even be thought not to exist. For something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist, and this is greater than that which can be thought of as non-existent. Hence, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it can't even be thought not to exist. Now, this is an argument often neglected, I think partly because it's very confusing. That is to say, you read this, even reading it into the camera here, I feel as if, good grief, this is gobbledygook. But it's not gobbledygook. Actually, he's saying something I think quite interesting. God is defined, remember, as the being the greater than which cannot be thought, greater than which cannot be conceived, the greatest conceivable being. Well, he's saying, can I even think of that being as not existing? Answer, no. Suppose I could think of that being as existing, but contingently, so that its existence was not necessary. Well then, I could think of something greater, namely something just like it that existed, whose existence was necessary. So I have to conceive of that being as existing and as existing necessarily. Now, the difference between this and the Proslogion 2 argument is that there he's arguing that I have to think of this being as existing. Here he's thinking, I can't even think of it as existing contingently. I have to think of it as existing necessarily. Well, once again, we can worry that there's a difference between thinking of something as existing necessarily and that being's really existing necessarily. But in this case, you might think, and we'll come back to this question, but you might think, well, maybe it's easier to bridge that. After all, if something really exists with metaphysical necessity, that's something that seems maybe potentially more accessible to us epistemically than something that exists but contingently and depending on factors that we may or may not know about the world. So, for example, consider numbers. Most people think of numbers as existing and as existing necessarily. And that seems something that we can access just through mental effort a priori. You don't have to find out something about the world to find out that there are numbers or that those numbers have a kind of independent and necessary existence. Now, of course, you don't have to think of numbers as existing in the sense that you could adopt a different philosophy of mathematics, maybe. So in that sense, some people can think of numbers as not existing at all. But if they exist, it seems, they exist necessarily. It's not like you can find out something or ask the National Science Foundation for a grant to find out whether the number 3 exists. It's not a contingent matter. It's not an empirical question. If the number 3 exists, it exists of necessity and with a metaphysical necessity. So you might think the same thing is true about God, that if God exists at all, God must exist necessarily. And we're going to look at that in the context of modern versions of this Proslogion 3 modal argument. But for now, let's take that argument of Anselm, which seems to be entirely about what can be conceived, and so perhaps to fall into the trap of thinking that there is this move we can make between idea and reality. And again, as I was saying, it may be easier here because the nature of the connection feels metaphysical in this kind of case where we're talking about necessary existence. But in any case, put that aside for the moment and just put the argument in material mode, as Carnap might have said, taking it in a way that doesn't talk about conceivability at all, but instead talks about possibility and necessity. That is, as a straightforwardly modal argument. So we can interpret his talk about something being conceivable, something as possibly existing. We could think about something that it's possible to think of or conceive as possibility. We can think of something that can't be thought not to exist as existing necessarily. So let's do that little interpretation where we construe all of this not really as about what's in the understanding, what can be conceived, but instead as about what could exist, what must exist. Well, then we could define God, or maybe more neutrally just a divine being, as something the greater than which cannot be thought. So in other words, we could say, this is something that is sort of maximally perfect in every possible respect. So we could define, in fact, a divine being as something that has all perfections, something that is maximally perfect. Can't think of anything greater is the way he would put it. We might say, can't be anything greater, okay, is the greatest possible being. Now, necessary existence. Well, that seems like one of those perfections. Suppose this being that nothing could be greater than didn't exist. Well, then it would be greater to exist. But suppose it existed, but existed contingently. It'd be greater to exist necessarily. So if a being has all perfections, and really there could be nothing greater, it must have necessary existence. That divine being is conceivable, possibly exists. So it's possible that a divine being exists, but if it exists necessarily. So now we get this startling modal move, so it must exist necessarily. Well, that's a little dramatic, but what's going on here? We're making a move. We're saying, look, if a divine being exists, it exists necessarily. In fact, look, if it is even possible, if I can have this in my mind, you might say, but translating it into the material mode, if it is possible for there to be a being with all perfections of this kind, it must be one that actually exists necessarily, and in that existing necessarily exists in this world. Well, why? Because if that being really is perfect, nothing could be greater than it. Something that existed merely contingently would be such that you could have something greater, something just like it, but that existed necessarily. So, God, if God is even possible, must exist necessarily. But God's existence is at least possible. It's not obvious. Let's say it's not clear that God's non-existence is some kind of necessary truth. So if you think God's existence is even possible, then you're committed to thinking that God exists and exists necessarily. Well, that move from possibly this perfect being exists to necessarily that perfect being exists does seem rather startling. How does it come about? Well, it's actually a valid argument in the most popular modal logic, a logic called S5. C.I. Lewis developed 5 different systems of modal logic, and the one that is most common, the one that's really assumed all the way up to the 20th century by every philosopher who thinks about these questions, is S5. Even today, people tend to accept S5 for metaphysical possibility and necessity. It's a conception where all the possible worlds are really available to one another. You think of all the possibilities as together in a collection, and they're all, as it were, accessible from one another. They're all in the same plane. Classically, people thought of them as existing as something like ideas in the mind of God. And so think of God as thinking of all the possibilities. All the possibilities really are possibilities, and we can think of them all as being in the same collection of possibilities. Well, if that's right, this works. Norman Malcolm developed a version in a modern context of the ontological argument, and it's strikingly simple. It simply says God's existence is at least possible, but if God exists necessarily. In fact, that seems like a necessary truth about God. It's part of the concept of God, the concept of any divine being, that it can't just exist contingently. If it exists necessarily. But it follows that God exists necessarily. So we have a very simple argument. Premise 1, God's existence is possible. Premise 2, it's a necessary truth that if God exists at all, then God exists necessarily. Conclusion, God exists necessarily. That argument is valid in S5. Here's one way to think about it. Suppose God's existence is possible. Then there is some possible world in that collection of possible worlds where God exists. Now, if God exists anywhere, it's a necessary truth that if God exists, for example, in that world, then God exists necessarily in that world. But what does it mean for something to exist necessarily? It means there's not even a possibility that it doesn't exist. So that means, in other words, it has to exist in every possible world. So it exists in our world. It is moreover necessary in our world because that being exists in every possible world. So we go from the existence of God in one world to the existence of God in every world simply because God's existence anywhere entails that God exists everywhere in that space of possibilities. Well, that's a pretty remarkable conclusion. Now, there is a difference between the Anselmian argument that talks about conceivability and that argument that talks about possibility instead. One of those arguments concludes that we can't even think of God as not existing. The other concludes that God exists necessarily. And there is a big difference. That gap we were worried about between conceiving of something as existing or as existing necessarily, and the thing really existing or really existing necessarily, is the gap between those two arguments. So we've got to be able to support the premise that it's possible for God to exist in order to make that jump. Now, one way of doing that, a traditional way, is to say, well, I can conceive of God as existing, and if I can conceive of something, then it must be possible. But we've got to be careful about that. It could turn out, for example, that there's a problem there, that we can conceive of things that couldn't possibly be. Could you conceive of water as having a chemical composition other than H2O? Suppose you could. But you might say it's a necessary truth that water is H2O. So actually there you're having a concept of something that is impossible. Could you conceive of a certain mathematical question, the answer to which is unknown, coming out one way or the other way? Yeah, maybe you can conceive of that, you think. But surely, either it's one thing or another thing, that is to say, if it's something that can be proved true or false at all, it's going to be necessarily true or necessarily false. And so we might begin to doubt whether conceivability is a good guide to possibility. Something that really intensifies that is an objection raised by J.N. Findlay back in the 1940s. He said, can't we turn this argument on its head, turn it around, and use it as an argument that God can't even possibly exist? He said, look, I think I can conceive of God's non-existence. So if it's possible to make this move, it's possible that God doesn't exist. But if God exists at all, then God exists necessarily. It follows that God doesn't exist. In fact, that God's existence turns out to be impossible. To put it in that modal context we were talking about, he's basically saying, I can conceive of a world where God doesn't exist. So let's assume there is such a world. Well, then there's a world where there is no God. But wait a minute, we said if God exists in a world, God exists necessarily, and so God exists in all the worlds. So if there's even one world where God doesn't exist, God can't exist in any world, so God's existence becomes impossible. It makes us question whether conceivability is actually a very good guide to possibility at all. Actually, if Anselm is right in the first place, or if our reconstructed modal argument is right, it isn't possible for God not to exist. But if you think, I could conceive of God as not existing, I mean, there's something not entirely conceptually incoherent about the atheist position, then you would say, well, it turns out that these arguments are just on a par. Now, some people have tried to respond that actually it's easier to conceive of God's existence than God's non-existence. But others have replied, no, I find it easier to conceive of God's non-existence than to conceive of God's existence. So how should we think about that? One way to think about it is to say it's a toss-up, but another is to go back to the Proslogion 2 argument and to say, can you really conceive of God as not existing? That's exactly what that argument meant to challenge. So suppose we think that Anselm is making this argument in two stages. In Proslogion 2, he's saying not so much what he appears to be saying, that I've proved that God exists in reality, but actually I've shown that you can't have a concept of God as not existing, or merely as maybe existing. Instead, your concept of God has to be of that being as existing. You have to conceive of God as existing if you conceive of God at all. Then, this idea that I can conceive of God not existing, that Findlay puts forward, has to be wrong. Anselm's reply is, no, you can't. You can't conceive of God as not existing. You can fail to conceive of God. That's certainly possible. People do that all the time. But you can't conceive of God as not existing. And so I think Anselm's Proslogion 2 argument might be conceived of not as making the bridge between ideas and reality all by itself, but instead saying, I am giving you this claim that actually does break the tie between thinking, some people say they can conceive of God as existing, some think they can conceive of God as not existing. If they're both right, then God's existence is both possible and therefore necessary, but also possibly not happening and therefore impossible. What do I do? Anselm says, wait a minute. You can't conceive of God as not existing. You have to make that mental leap from God to God as existent in your mind, just at the concept of God itself. And so actually there is not a parallel. You can't conceive of God as not existing. So it's not a parallel bridge that gets you to God's possibility and therefore necessity, and God's possibly not existing and therefore impossibility. Actually, the one concept that you would think you had to start on your journey across the bridge, you can't have. Now that by itself does not establish a link between conceivability and possibility. But what it does is imply that the person who thinks that actually you can, if you accept any link at all, can push it in both directions, has to be wrong. In any case, that's one way of thinking how Proslogion 2 and Proslogion 3 fit together. The modal argument is still something people take seriously. It's something people still raise objections to. It is a deep challenge, I think, in a way that goes beyond perhaps the argument in Proslogion 2, simply because it says there is perhaps a way of getting from conceivability to possibility. But whatever you think about that, God's possibility entails God's necessity. And so, really, the person who is to defend the claim that God doesn't exist has to claim God's existence is not only not real, that God's existence is impossible. And that's a hard task to perform. You might argue there's something about the concept that is just incoherent. You might try to argue that there's something about the nature of reality that precludes God's existence. But in any case, the metaphysical burden should clearly be, if Anselm is right, on the person who tries to deny God's existence.